Good morning.
Professional skills.
Like they're born on.
It's a trouble, it's irregular.
Well, I had two breakfasts ordered this delivered this morning, so
That's wrong.
she is coming at 9.
You could be doing all the percent or free department.
Yeah.
Okay, go. Great. Good morning. So today starts our ethics module, and we'll cover a variety of topics from sort of nuts and bolts of how to stay out of trouble to the really giving thought to ethical underpinnings of what research projects can uncover and as the relationships develop between researchers and between researchers and their research subjects. So this morning we're fortunate to have Dr. Jeff Engler as the presenter to talk about ethics for authors. Dr. Engler is a professor in the Department of Biochemistry and Molecular Genetics. He's a virologist by training. He's the associate dean in the graduate school who is responsible for several different minority education support programs, a lot of other aspects of graduate training. And he's also the, I'm not sure the exact title of
I'm the research integrity officer for UAB. So when you mess up or someone thinks you messed up, it comes to my office.
Right. And so these are events that are not only traumatic to the people involved, but also very expensive to the university just to investigate them. And so it's really important that we do everything we can up front to try to avoid the kind of problems that end up in Jeff's store. So he's been very involved in our training programs all along. We're very grateful to have him here. And so we'll have this topic for the first hour. In the second hour, Carrie Oliver from the IRB will be here to introduce you to the IRB process.
Thanks, David. So good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Jeff Engler, and I'm here to talk to you about research ethics, but in particular, I'm going to focus today on authorship. But authorship is one of the, what we call the 9 aspects of responsible content research that the Office of Research Integrity in Washington, D.C. requires us to talk to all of our researchers about on a periodic basis. And so authorship is one of those 9 things. Protection of human subjects and materials is another aspect. You'll hear that from Carrie Oliver later this morning. But I'm going to focus particularly on authorship because there's such a wide variation on what different disciplines and different investigators think is the right thing to do about authorship. So I want to sort of talk about authorship and specifically about how to avoid being accused of plagiarism, because that's one of the things that can get you into trouble and can get you reported to my office and start that whole process, which is no fun for anybody. So I'm going to focus particularly on ethics for authorship, but it's one of those 9 topic areas that we expect every researcher to know about and to uphold the highest standards. Because, as I say, research ethics, the responsible conduct of research, is the promise that we make to each of ourselves and each of our colleagues that we will uphold the highest standards of behavior, that we won't cut corners, that we will make sure that we manage the data appropriately, that we keep things confidential, that we treat authors on papers and contributors and participants in our research in the publications in an appropriate way. So that's part of what we're going to talk about today, although we're going to focus mostly on the ideas of how do you avoid plagiarizing other people's work. So if you had to guess, I mean, why do we even talk about plagiarism? What would you say, how big a problem is it, do you suppose, that people use other people's work without attribution? Think it's a big problem or a small problem? Anyone want to venture a guess? I see some thumbs up going up. What do you think? Is it 50%? You think? So there was a survey done of undergraduates at a prestigious university, completely anonymous. They asked them, over the course of your 4 years at this university, have you ever plagiarized? What do you suppose? Again, anonymous survey, no consequence to answering correct or telling the truth. What fraction of the people who participated would have admitted to having plagiarized something? Do you think it's a big number or a small number? Big number. Anyone want to venture a guess?
I would say small.
Small?
I think more people plagiarize than they realize.
Okay. Maybe they're not aware that they're cutting and pasting off an internet web page.
So did they explain to them what plagiarism means?
Yes, in the context of the survey.
70%.
70%. Any other guess? We had a small number. Well, in fact, when you look at the survey, it was about 50%. And most of it was cutting and pasting off the web page. And that's pretty easy to detect if you're an academic, if you're a professor writing papers. There was also a big scandal in 2006 where at Ohio University, where 46 of 68 master's theses in a particular master's program in engineering, the introductory 30 pages of the master's thesis were all identical in 46 different ones among 5 professors in a department. And half of them were the chair of the department. Half of the students were students of the chair of the department. It happened over 15 years, and nobody caught it. And the chair lost his endowed professorship, he lost the chairmanship, there were lots of repercussions. It was a huge stain on the reputation of Ohio University. And people have done text surveys of articles in Medline. Medline is the place where we all go to find research to help our projects along. And they identified 212 articles that were potentially plagiarized, where the abstracts were virtually word for word the same among 2 articles. So it can be a big problem, and it's not just students or trainees or residents or whomever who does it, it's also faculty. So here's faculty who've been accused of plagiarism, and in particular I want to talk about Dr. Twitchell, who was a very well-known professor of English. He was writing articles for the New York Times. He was well regarded in his discipline, and he was interested in he studied Christian businesses and how they sold to a Christian community. And so here is the first bullet point is a quote from an article that was written by someone else. And the second bullet is something that Dr. Twitchell published about a year later. What do you notice about those two? What do you notice? It's virtually an entire list of that part. And this is not just one isolated incident. This happened over and over and over again in his writing, using other people's words, other people's language without attribution, without citing it, without putting it in quotes. So plagiarism, the thing that gets you in trouble, is defined, it has 2 parts to the definition. First, it's using other people's original work in whole or in part without giving credit, without giving a citation, without putting it in quotes. And the second part of it is it's done in an effort to get something. It may be a grade in a class, it might be your next grant, it might be a publication, it might be getting a check in the mail for an article you've written for the New York Times, but there's some benefit to you to having plagiarized. And plagiarism, so when the Office of Research Integrity comes and talks to me about things they've heard about people at UAB, it always comes down to three things. It's either fabrication, which means you made up the data, and there's no basis in fact that you ever did the experiment. It's falsification, which means you did the experiment, but you changed the data, so that it no longer represents what you observed. And the third is plagiarism. And that can be people's words in a document, or it can be people's data, where you use other people's data and pretend that it's your own. So we call that FFP, fabrication, falsification, plagiarism. So we're talking today about plagiarism, mostly in terms of text, but it also can be the plagiarism of other people's data. So let's try some examples. So my colleague Jennifer Greer is our writing coach in the graduate school. She is well trained in English and in writing and in academic writing, and she wrote this document here. So one of the ways that professors in school will look at for plagiarism, I'll put it into Turnitin. And Turnitin looks for 6 words in a row which are identical to something else in its database. If you put this wording into Turnitin, Turnitin says this is perfectly new writing. This is completely original thought. What do you think? Does anybody recognize this? Gettysburg Address. 87 years ago. 87 years ago. Our ancestors established on the North American continent a new country. Our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. So it survives Turnitin, but it's clearly plagiarized. How about this one? I'm dreaming that someday the United States will live up to the real significance of its founding and believe that all men are equal. Put that through Turnitin, it's original writing. It can't be found anywhere else in the database. What do you think?
Is that Martin Luther King?
Martin Luther King, I have a dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I'm dreaming that someday the United States will live up to the real significance of its founding and believe that all men are created equal. So it's plagiarized even though it survives Turnitin. So Turnitin is not the be-all and end-all. And there's many kinds of plagiarism. Those are pretty egregious examples that can fool the software that we all rely on to find plagiarism. But in fact, a lot of the plagiarism that people talk about is what we call accidental plagiarism. There's a psychological term called cryptomnesia. And cryptomnesia is you read something and you may forget that you've read it and then recapitulate it think it's your own. So there was a famous example of a teenage girl who wrote a very famous novel while she was in high school about the trials and tribulations of being a teenager. And it got a lot of press. She was on a lot of talk shows. It sold a lot of books. And she went to Harvard on the basis of her having written this book and having really great grades. And while she was at Harvard, people began to talk about the parts of this book that seemed similar to other books. And it turns out that sections of her book were almost verbatim copies of things she had read and forgotten about. Forgotten she had read. And this is a psychological thing called cryptomnesia, where you read something and you remember it in your subconscious, but you don't remember that you remember it. And you think it's your own. The other place where you're really tempted to do binge writing or to do plagiarism is when you're on a deadline. And so, I don't know about you, but I sometimes have the bad habit that I have 50 books open around me on a big table and I'm typing and I'm saying, oh, I couldn't say that any better than what they said over here, and I couldn't say that any better than what's over here. And I get it all jumbled in my mind because I'm on deadline and it just happens. So you have to develop a writing process that avoids last minute, the last minute kind of writing where you've got a giant project ready to write up and you only have a couple of hours. So again, we call that binge writing, and that's a prime example where plagiarism is really a temptation. So let's think about some case studies. So this is actually something that happened here. And so we had 3 students in a class who were working on a collaborative research paper, and they were in an online course. So they never met. They were at different locations around the country, but they had to collaborate together to complete this paper. And so one student sort of decided to be the lead person and putting the pieces of the paper together. And so a second student mailed in his contributions to the paper. And Lee, when he was doing his editorial work on it, realized that was work he had read before. And when he looked at what he knew about Mick and his writing style, the materials he got to include in their joint paper seemed to be written in a different style than what Mick normally wrote in. And so he wondered what to do. So Lee Googled the text and he found it. He found the text verbatim on a website. And there was a source, a quotation, but he couldn't find any quotes around the author's original material and what Mick provided. So it was impossible to know what Mick wrote and what Mick had copied. So the question is, should Lee be concerned about this? And what should he do? Should he be concerned about this, that he was able to find the text elsewhere? If you think, and then why or why not? Okay, it's clearly plagiarized, so should he be concerned? Okay, so he should be concerned. What would you suggest that he do? Let's see. Here are some examples. Here are some examples of things he could do. Why don't we take a minute or two, talk with your neighbor, and see which one of these you think would be the appropriate thing to do. What do you think is the appropriate thing to do? Who believes one is the right thing to do? Who believes one is the right thing to do? Who believes 2 is the right thing to do? Okay. So why is 2? Why? What's your reasoning for why 2 is the right thing to do?
Give him a shot to correct it.
Okay, so you give him a shot to correct what he did. So you assume innocent until proven guilty. Are there any other tricks up there that anyone wants to defend?
3.
3? Okay, why 3?
Well, he's obviously guilty.
Okay. He's obviously- Clearly, there's something going on here.
What if you sent him the link that you found and say, this is what I found, can you fix this? So
Okay.
that he at least knows where you're coming from?
Okay.
Because you just mentioned the word, I forgot that the girl published a book, she just concentrate, recall. So I don't know that it's really a real possibility and it's an excuse, but however, just
Okay. So in the real situation, Lee assumes Mick is innocent and contacts them and says, you know, I found this text here and here's the link, can you fix it? And Lee says, and Vic says, oh, I'm sorry that happened, I'll fix it. And 24 hours later he sends text which is basically unchanged. What would you do next? What would you do next? Would you still do two?
No.
Which one would you do?
Well, you do some combination of one. Get the group together, sit down, talk about it. If that doesn't work, move forward.
I'd tell Nick that I was gonna do this, that I'm,
Okay.
or for me.
Well, in fact, that's in fact what Lee chose to do, was to involve Sarah and them in a conversation. And it was only after that conversation broke down that we ever found out about it. That Lee and Sarah called the instructor. And that's how we discovered the story. Because they tried to be collegial and help each other learn, make it a learning situation, and Nick was just impossible to teach. Okay, so again, part of being an author in an academic setting is understanding what your identity is as a researcher and a scholar. I mean, your reputation now and in the future depends in part on how you present yourself as a researcher from the earliest days that you do research. And so it's important that you become an efficient writer, that you make sure that your writing meets academic standards, that you adopt best practices. We're going to show you the ethical summary protocol in a minute. And then, like Lee did in the example, you need to exhibit some leadership. You need to show leadership as you are involved in writing projects that involve many people. Other members of your research team, your research mentor, the head of the laboratory, department chair, whoever. You need to be a leader in terms of helping to set the standards for what's acceptable in terms of your writing practice. So we're going to practice what we call the ethical summary protocol. This was a protocol developed by our former director of professional development at the graduate school, Julia Austin, and our writing coach, Dr. Jennifer Greer. And it's a way to take your notes in a way that you can use those notes in publications without fear of being accused of plagiarism. And the problem that the ethical summary protocol tries to address is what we call mosaic plagiarism. So when we saw the two examples, the I Have a Dream speech and the Gettysburg Address, those were examples of what we call mosaic plagiarism, really good examples, but mosaic plagiarism is saying, you know, I really can't say that any better, so I'll change a word here and I'll change a word there, but I'm going to leave all the sentences in the same order, the flow of the paragraph in the same order, but I'm going to add a word here and a word there to make it look different. That's mosaic plagiarism. And it's really tempting to do. And so here's a study from Roig in 2001 who surveyed psychology professors and asked them to paraphrase things which were close to what their topic of interest was and things which were difficult, far away from, and things which they weren't very familiar with. And if they got a passage that they were familiar with, it was easy for them to paraphrase because they were comfortable with the language and they could summarize and distill using their disciplinary skills. But when it was difficult, when it was something far away from what they knew, about a quarter of them couldn't manage more than mosaic plagiarism. And so that's a problem. The ethical summary protocol is designed to help you take notes in a way which will keep you out of trouble. So that's this one-page handout you all should have. And again, the summary protocol itself is on one page, and the activity we want to do in class is on the other side. So it's basically 5 parts. I'm going to ask you to read an 8-sentence section of writing. I want you to take notes on just the strategic points. And so if you know journalism, who, what, when, where, and why, for example. What it is you need to know to remember what you wrote. And then I'm going to ask you to hide the text and write a 1 or 2 sentence summary of the material based only on your notes. And then we'll come back together and we'll test your writing, your summary for relevance, accuracy, and that it's in your own words. And then we'll ask you how you would cite it. So we're going to take about 4 minutes for you to read and take your notes. And so if you look on this side of the page, I want you to fold the page so that so there's a space there to take your notes. So I'll put the material up here, and it's also down here on the paper in bold. So take your notes there, and then when we're after about 4 minutes, I'm going to ask you to fold the paper so you can't see the writing anymore, and just the notes. And then I'm going to ask you to write your summary down here. 1 sentence or 2 sentences about what you've written. Okay? So, today's college students represent the first generations to grow up with digital technology. And so forth. So there's 8 sentences there. Read those 8 sentences and take some notes. We'll take 3 or 4 minutes, and then I'll ask you to fold the paper so you can't see the writing and to write your 1 or 2 sentence summary. The same text is in bold on the piece of paper if you'd rather see it close up. And you're just taking notes at this point. All right, if you've taken your notes, please fold the paper so that all you can see are the notes and the place where you write your summary. So write a 1 or 2 sentence summary based only on your notes of what you read. Don't forget to conclude the citation. Ready to report out? So who'd like to share their summary? Who'd like to share their summary? Okay, please.
Today's college students have grown up spending thousands of hours in front of screens with little time reading. As such, they process things differently than previous generations, possibly due to different brain structures.
Okay. Is it, we'll do the rap test, is it relevant? Is it accurate? Is it a paraphrase that's not using the same language as the original text? I think that's correct. So it meets all three criteria. What would your citation be? How would you cite that? Yeah, so if this was 2 sentences in your manuscript, how would you reference it? Okay.
I'm not sure.
Okay. Let's try someone else. Someone else read us theirs. Who would like to volunteer?
So
Okay.
I wrote Dr. Bruce Perry studying evolution of brain structure in younger generation who spends significantly more time in front of the electronic medium compared to their parents.
Okay.
And Dr. Perry thinks such experience will result in altered brain function in younger generation.
Okay. Is it relevant? Is it accurate? Is it a paraphrase? How would you cite it?
I just, if it is like in continuation with the text, I just put a parenthesis and.
Yeah. But so if we went to your reference list, how would you refer to it in your reference list?
So Prensky.
No, you actually in your case, because you focused on Dr. Perry, you have to say Perry as cited in Prensky. Because Prensky is quoting Perry. So in your case, you'd have to say Perry as cited by Prensky, because you focused your summary on Perry, not Prensky.
I have a question about that citation. So let's say you found this, and this is where your first lead in this direction, and then you went and you found some articles that Perry had written himself, and so you go back and do those. But where you really got the idea was here, and maybe you're not saying anything more than what is actually here, what he was cited in this, like he was quoted in this article. But you have read that other stuff, and that surely probably has impacted your writing too. So when do you kind of go back and forth and say, well, actually I'm citing Perry's papers that he wrote on the subject versus his, just what was content here?
As a rule of thumb, you're always better off citing the original research. So this is a citation of the original research. So if you've gone back and read Perry's original papers, you're better off citing those. But if you've not gone back and read Perry, and you're relying solely on Prensky, then Perry has cited in Prensky. So if Prensky got it wrong, it's Prensky's fault, not yours. But you're always better off citing the original literature.
Are there cases when you would just cite both? Like if
You could.
the idea was related to how Prensky presented it?
Yeah. If your reading of Perry's work is consistent with what Prensky says, then citing both places would be okay too. But as a rule of thumb, you always want to cite the original. Unless there's some good reason not to. Yes.
I have a question. So it's acceptable to cite some review article that they summarize things? You just cite a review article about their opinion?
It depends on the situation. So if you're saying, here's a review of the field and what we know about it, then a review is appropriate. But if you say, in the review it cites specific data, you're better off going to the original source. But if you're saying, I'm a virologist, I study adenovirus, and so in my papers oftentimes will say, for a review of the field of adenovirology, see, and I'll put 3 or 4 review article citations in there. Just to give people a place that they can go to get an overview of what the issues are that I'm trying to address in the paper.
If you're citing just canonical signaling pathways, like JAK-STAT or NPK, I tend to put review articles for that.
That certainly works. And again, it gets to the idea, so one of the sort of gray areas is about what's common knowledge. And what's common knowledge depends in part on the audience. So if I said to you, the structure of double-stranded DNA is a double helix, as an audience of scientists, you probably would all recognize that I wasn't the one who came up with that idea, but it's Watson and Crick. But it's what, for us as researchers or molecular biologists, or we would say that's common knowledge. Everyone knows that Watson and Crick solved that structure. But if you were talking to a general audience, they might not know that. So if you were writing an article for a journal where JAK-STAT pathways were half the papers, you could argue that you could cite review articles perhaps, or maybe that's considered common knowledge and doesn't even need to be cited. Again, it's a judgment call about your audience. So if I were going to write an article for Scientific American about JAK-STAT pathways, I might want to have more references because the general public who reads Scientific American aren't going to know all the details. But for a journal that was a journal of JAK-STAT pathways, that might be a common enough knowledge base that you could loosen the rules about citation, at least about sort of what JAK-STAT is all about and all of that. But still cite to them specific things that buttress your argument and your data. So it becomes a judgment call. You have to consider what your audience is and what kind of knowledge you can assume that they have. Okay. Does anyone, can we have a third person share their summary? Go ahead.
I said today's generation of college graduates have interacted with digital technology throughout their lives, spending twice as much time playing video games as reading. These experiences have likely shaped their brain structure and way of processing information.
Okay. Relevant? Accurate? Paraphrase in her own words? Okay, so it meets the RAP test. How would you cite it?
I think I would put citations to Prensky at the end of those sentences.
Okay. You do bring in the idea of brain structure. Was that Prensky's idea or was that Perry's idea?
I guess we could say yeah.
So in that case, you might want to cite Perry as cited in Prensky. Or go back to the original literature and read the Perry stuff. Yes?
I guess what I keep thinking about is that this is basically a synthesis of a bunch of other information. And so are we citing that we're kind of usually, we got this idea of how to synthesize this information from Krinsky, or that we're going to take all the stuff he summarized, go back and find it, and then re-synthesize it on our own?
Well, if you're only going to use this as Prensky's synthesis of the field, then you would cite Prensky.
Okay. So you could basically say, you don't need to cite Perry.
Only if you're bringing the idea of the different brain structures.
But if it's within Krinsky, and you're just kind of summarizing it.
So Prensky's contribution in this example is all this stuff about the first generations and all the video games and the number of hours. What Perry's contribution within it is the difference in the brain structures. So if in your summary you bring in the brain structures, you have to say Perry is cited in Prensky. If all you talk about is how many hours average college graduate spending on video games and things, that's Prensky. That's not using any of Perry's ideas. It becomes a judgment call. But these are the kind of nuances that can trip you up.
How do we know that Prensky is the original source for what he wrote?
You like the hour.
You take it on faith. I mean, again, that's the promise we make to each other in the field, is that Prensky has done his or her due diligence to be sure that this work is accurate. And you assume that Prensky has appropriately summarized what Perry's work was. And that's why you use Perry as cited in, because that way, if Prensky got it wrong about what Perry thought, your reference list clearly identifies Prensky as the source of that misunderstanding.
How about dividing them into two sentences and cite Prensky in the first sentence after the first sentence and Perry after the second?
You could. Yes?
And another thing about, like, when you divide it into a couple of sentences, and so assuming we were writing an article or a paper about how we thought brain development was changed by experiences of children growing.
Okay.
So that's what, and so we're making the assumption that ahead of time, like we already think that that's true. That was our assumption, and then we were out looking for stuff to support it. And so, like when I wrote my first sentence, it was, brain development in young adults of this generation is likely to be impacted by the abundance of technology they experience throughout their lives. If that was something that I brought in here and then I found this supported it, would I cite Krinsky on the first sentence too? As well as, or would I say, well, that's something I've already written. If this is supporting it, but it's not.
Supporting data comes from Prensky. This is an idea that's in the literature. This is what my research paper is going to be about. Ideas that references that support this idea include Prensky. Yeah, David.
I just wanted to embellish a little bit what Dr. Rhodes asked here. So I think there's a sort of revolution going on at NIH now in terms of reproducibility is one of the issues, but really it's methodologic rigor in science, and people are going to be held to the standard of really demonstrating the fundamental foundations for the research they're proposing to do are correct. So just the fact that you reference something that's published for NIH isn't going to be enough. You're going to have to ultimately provide strong, make it clear that you've really thought through whether the foundations you're building your ideas on stand up to rigorous scientific evaluation. So, it's just like if you really want to become a scholar in an area, you can't just read review papers and become a scholar. You have to go to the primary sources and be sure that what the review papers, how they synthesize it, is correct. So
again,
it's a complicated issue.
The gold standard would be go back to the original literature and be sure that the review article has it right. Because sometimes they don't.
Is this what they say, or is this what they're actually doing? Because I know they're reading these things at the kids' basketball game. I mean, not, how much due diligence are they actually
so,
it?
In the end, it's going to depend on how study sections interpret what the NIH is trying to do. But I think the NIH is responding to a sort of crisis in confidence that, there's been a lot of public press that a substantial portion of what's published in some of the highest profile, most newsy kind of journals doesn't ever get reproduced and is probably not correct.
And may lead the field down the wrong pathway.
Right. So I think study sessions are going to try to be reasonable about how they interpret this, but they're going to be influenced. Right? It's a little hard to know how it's going to play out. There are talks going on around the campus over the next couple of months that are trying to help people know how to try to address some of these issues in grant applications, right? Because it's going to be something that affects how you're going to deal with it.
So I'm helping a postdoc write her fellowship, and as we were working over her past work, and her graduate thesis disproved an effect of chromium on a process, and that disproof overturned 30 years of belief that was based on one paper. But for 30 years, everyone in the field had believed that this was true, and her thesis was proved that it was false. So there's a reproducibility issue, and so it's, what do we take as gospel? What do we take as scientific fact, and how true is it? And that's part of reproducibility, and our rigor as members of this research community in terms of the way we uphold and support our science, all those kind of things. It's a bigger ethical conversation. So we've had 3 examples of summaries of this paragraph. What did you notice about each of the 3 summaries? You all read the same 8 sentences. What would you say about the 3 summaries you heard? What would you identify in them? Were they the same or different? They were different. Each person, as they paraphrase a piece of text, is going to pull out different things. And that sort of gets to the reproducibility question, but it says that by paraphrasing, you're pulling out the things that you at that moment find important in terms of your summary, and that makes all of your summaries unique. And there's a Noam Chomsky, who's a linguist, who talks about how we can read something and all of us take something different away from it. And each of those things we take away from it is still true, but it's our paraphrase, it's our using our experiences to figure out what's important as we took our notes. And so there's lots and lots of different ways to take the same piece of writing and summarize it. And that gets you away from then the temptation of plagiarism. If you will read a paper and make a 2 or 3 or 4 sentence summary of it and file that away in Evernote or your index cards or whatever, when you come back and want to use that information in a paper, your paraphrase is already written, and you know it's not going to plagiarize it because you've checked it with the RAP test right after you read the paper. So again, it helps buffer you against the temptation to just cut and paste something out of a web page or out of something else. I use my phone a lot to do paraphrasing. So I'll go to a lecture and walking back to my office, I'll write 2 or 3 sentences about what I learned in the lecture and put the citation in. Or if I read a paper, I'll try to use my phone to just write a sentence or 2 about the paper and what I thought the take-home points were along with the citation. And I put those in Evernote because I use Evernote a lot. And those are there ready for my next paper when I need that piece of data. And I can be sure that I haven't plagiarized what I read.
If I understand you correctly, it's the presentation of the information, not the information itself, that makes the difference.
It's the presentation in your own words and that you then cite the source. So in each case, I asked what your citation was. It doesn't mean you can't, because it's your own words, doesn't mean you don't have to cite the source, but it means that you haven't copied it word for word. And again, in the sciences, we tend not to do, in humanities, and people will put things in quotes and use a direct quote. In science, we tend not to do that. We tend to use paraphrases. If you read a scientific paper, you don't see quoted material very often. And that's kind of a cultural thing for our disciplines, is that we don't do that. But in humanities, they do. So again, part of what's plagiarism and what's not plagiarism depends on your disciplinary experience and the expectations. You would still need to cite, if you use your summary from today in a paper, you would still need to cite Frensky or go back to the original Perry author papers. It's not that you get out of citing by paraphrasing, but it allows you to use that information that you gleaned from that paper or from that block of text in a way which isn't plagiarized. But it doesn't mean but it doesn't excuse you from having to cite it. And each of your summaries will be different in that, and that's the beauty of this, of doing a paraphrase. Again, so we've had a pretty lively discussion already. Are there any other questions we can talk about? Yes, Dave.
So when you're writing your dissertation, you have total room to do as much citing as you think is required, but a lot of journals don't allow you to have more than 30 references or something like that. And so do you recommend a certain kind of disclaimer to put into your writing to acknowledge that you're using other people's ideas, but it's a format that you can't cite everybody effectively, or do you just sort of, I've never tried to do that.
I never have either. I mean, again, that's an unfortunate limitation that the journals impose sometimes, from the point of view of space and cost, not from the point of view of academic integrity. Again, it depends on where the boundary line is between what's common knowledge and what you need to cite, because people aren't going to know from where you've drawn that. Again, it's a judgment call. But by paraphrasing, by citing, we're trying to help develop your sense of what judgments you ought to make as you do this, as you do your academic writing.
Could you maybe comment a little bit on the concept of self-plagiarism and where that's an issue?
This, again, is one of those really gray areas. And some of my colleagues will beat me mercilessly when I tell them they've self-plagiarized. And it happens most often in materials and methods. You go, oh my goodness, I haven't done a single thing different than in this paper that I did in the last 3. And so why can't I just cut and paste it? And the answer is that's self-plagiarism. Those other papers are copyrighted, and so by using that material without citation is plagiarism. And you can rewrite materials and methods, and if you can't rewrite them, you can always say, we follow the protocol as described and put the citation for your last paper. So you don't even have to describe it. You just say, we use the same antibodies, the same Western blot technique as in our previous paper, and you put the citation for that. So that gets you out of self-plagiarism. And I will admit, this is an evolving concept. If you went back and looked at my papers on adenovirus, I bet 90% of them will start with the line, human adenovirus is a double-strand DNA virus with 36,000 base pairs. I'll bet you 90% of the papers all have that. And I'm going to fall on the sword of it was common knowledge and not plagiarism.
Not just your papers on adenovirus, but everybody.
But everybody's papers. When RNA splicing was first discovered, it was discovered in adenovirus, and there were about 4 different maps of the RNA transcripts in adenovirus that were all virtually identical, but that
each of those people demanded that they were the right map and that they were the one to be cited, the other three should not. And you go, that's silly. But it became a plagiarism issue, because an unresolved plagiarism issue, because they all said we came with this data, we made these maps with data independent of the other firm.
So what if you published in an open access journal? Theoretically, the journal doesn't own that anymore, it's still yours, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So is that still considered self-plagiarism?
Yes.
What did you say, that our methods are similar to what we previously reported, and then you could say the same thing again?
Yeah, but no, I wouldn't say exactly the same thing. That becomes self-plagiarism. But I'd say, so one of the ways we used to handle it was that the methods that we used are described in our previous paper with the following changes.
Okay.
Or with the following additions. And then we said, here's the antibodies we used, which were different than we used before, but we used the same Western blot protocol. Any other questions? All right. Well, almost. We gave you 2 minutes for a break. Thank you all for your attention today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I'm from Michigan. Don't take so much. I went
How are you this morning?
I'm good, how are you?
Rolling in the Not right now. Well, I mean, we get what we get.
I'm always
You didn't pay the fees.
Yeah.
There's a lot of gray areas. When you're ready to start, you have to push the button, it's glowing red, it looks like a microphone. And I've moved you to the other locations where people are.
Oh, are there,
There are people in the internet, the other locations, and the camera's right there. All these modules are monitoring.
in any way?
I never played physics.
It's sensitive. Well, it was moving.
You don't get too much of it.
I swear. I thought it was moving.
Thanks a million.
Okay.
Okay, so we're ready.
Yeah.
Really need questions. Well over.
Yeah, we can, use personnel, we're down, we're only down 2 now. We were down 5.
Honey
So
Johnson.
we're doing, including, yeah, that was including Jonathan. Jonathan's one of them now, because Leslie's having to do all of his work, so we don't have a Leslie.
You got a better grade?
Oh, you're. I'm so sorry. Our scintillating.
Where are you now?
So much more.
You're original? I'm sure.
Everybody's
You're well trained for life.
Got caught up in those projects, derailed. Yeah.
I just try to touch base so people don't forget.
Yeah.
Literally, people are just, Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, I forgot.
So,
Yeah.
You gotta stick to phone conversations, it seems to get quicker.
It is easier, you know, we try to document at least after we've done our job by viewing and responding, but sometimes the phone call
Yeah, like, oh, this is what you want, alright.
Okay, we're ready to go ahead and get started again. So I'm glad to introduce Carrie Oliver, who's from the Institution Review Board, and she's going to give an overview of the things that underlie effective human subjects protection and some of the history that led up to that. Next week we'll have a session led by Isabel Skorinsky, who will be talking about issues related to special populations, cultural competency kind of issues. The following week, we'll be talking about good clinical practices as they apply to clinical research programs and related issues. And then the next week, Tom Huddle, who's in general internal medicine, will be going into more detail about the underpinnings of some of the key kinds of human studies violations that have led to our current concepts of what's really the appropriate way to handle human subjects research. So,
Wow, you guys have some heavy hitters coming in. Isabel and I have a little bit of history. We actually went to Brazil together to launch a major tobacco cessation project that she had going on down there. And she's a brilliant woman, so y'all pay attention to her because she's really great. You'll learn a lot from her. She's so passionate and so excited, and you'll just love her. Me, I'm very passionate and excited too, but on a much less interesting subject. So it says overview and history. I'm not going to go into too much of the history of it. It sounds like you're actually going to get a little bit of that in a couple of weeks. The history spawns predominantly from our history through World War II onward. I'm going to go straight through some things. An IRB, I know most of you have heard it and probably have worked with us, but I like to go over it because I want people to really understand what we think we do as opposed to what you think we think we do. So we think that we're after the welfare and safety of human subjects. A lot of times that feels like we step into areas that we shouldn't belong. But most of the time when we're doing that, and I say most of the time because sometimes we do overstep and it's just human nature, but most of the time we're doing that because we have a human subjects protection bent on it. And they seem like, hey, they're mucking with my science, and really no, we're thinking, are you going to have enough people in your research to get the results you want to get? Therefore, are you making people go through a research study that will not yield any reasonable results, and you're wasting their time? So that's where we're coming from, even though it may seem in a weird place. We have people who oversee us. That's the OHRP. And the OHRP is in the middle of completely changing everything we're about to do. So we have a set of regs that are about yay, that go on and on and on. And all of them are about to change. So it'll be great fun in the next year or two as IRBs around the country adapt and figure out what's going on and regulations get adopted. The OHRP is separate from the FDA, so we also have to follow the FDA. We also have to follow HIPAA. We also have to follow DOD, DOJ. And all of them have, because it's the government, they all have just a little bit different in how they want to describe things. So a human subject to the FDA is different than the human subject to OHRP, which is different than how DOD sees it. So yay for us, and yay for you. So we have an IRB committee that you guys are all going to get to come to, and it's really fascinating. So drink your coffee ahead of time because sometimes it can be long.
But come in and really listen. You're going to get materials ahead of time. Look at them because it's fascinating to see the IRB process in action. I remember the first time I served on a jury, and I was just more fascinated by the process than the case. You know, I was just kind of like, oh, we get to do this, we get to do that. It's kind of the same thing here. So when you see how the different members of the IRB interact, you know, we have to have non-scientists, we have to have community members. That frustrates investigators a lot because we're always asking for things in lay language, and they're thinking, oh, you don't understand my science. Well, no, we don't. We don't. And we're not supposed to. Because if we have to understand your science, then you're missing the point of what the IRB is about. The IRB is about understanding what that means to the participant's experience. What is happening to them? What are they concerned about? So our community members, they look at your whole protocol from, what if it was me? What if that was my child? What if, you know, so, well, I want to know, are you going to feed me? I'm going to be there 8 hours. Where am I going to park? That's where they're coming from. Our non-scientists are looking at it from similar bents, but also we have to have one of our non-scientists or community members has to be a member of the clergy. So we want those ethics involved. We need a prisoner representation in there, not someone who's necessarily a prisoner, although it can be, or was a prisoner, but someone who works with prisoner populations because that's the most vulnerable population. We want to have a lot of diversity. We want men, women, people of all ages, people of all races, so that they represent the population who's going to be joining the research. So, and those are all requirements within the regulations. So we also serve as the HIPAA Privacy Board. That's not always the case at every research institution. Sometimes that's a separate thing, but most of the time that's the case too. So when we approve your waiver of consent, we'll also approve your HIPAA authorization waiver. I'm not going to, the other duties. I'm going to go over a couple of definitions, and they're really important because these are out of the regs. So this is direct quotes. So a research is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. Sounds great. Okay, write that down, you got it. Well, no one knows what the hell contributing to generalizable knowledge means, and no one's defined it, and so everybody has to kind of make that up as they go and try to figure it out. Somewhere, someone said, if you publish, that's contributing to generalizable knowledge. Well then, and everyone went, yay, we have a yardstick. And then OHRP came in and said, well, not necessarily, but they didn't define what not necessarily meant or when it would be or when it wouldn't be. So we don't know. So everyone is kind of a case by case. We look at it. What's the purpose of your study? What are you doing it for? We have to have both parts. It has to be systematic in nature and contribute to generalizable knowledge in order for it to be to be research with a capital R. So, for example, a case report may not be systematic in nature, but it could contribute to generalizable knowledge. Or a quality improvement could be very systematic in nature, but I'm only solving this one little problem at my unit or in my clinic or whatever. So there's a lot of things that feel and smell like research, but may not necessarily be research. So that's the first question we have to ask. And a lot of investigators like to leap to the second question first. Is it human subjects? That's not the first question. The first question is it research? So they'll take something like a QI and they'll think, because I'm doing a survey, I have to submit to the IRB. Because I'm dealing with people. I'm talking to people. So they leapt to the second question, is it human subjects, without answering the first. So the first question is, does it meet the definition of research? If the answer is yes, then we go, well, is it human subjects? Human subjects has a whole lot of other parts to it. First of all, living individuals, which means the opposite is not human subjects. So if you're doing research on decedent information, whole brains, we're just going to assume those people are dead. About whom an investigator conducting research obtains data through interaction or intervention. So interaction can mean I'm going to sit down and have an interview with you, I'm going to give you a drug, I'm going to ask you to do something, but it can also mean I'm going to send you an email with a link to a survey. You don't necessarily have to see the person or talk to the person in order for it to be an interaction. An email is an interaction. An intervention, I could never speak to you, but I could see whether you like lights dimmer or lighter. And I could be over here adjusting them and never speak to you. That's an intervention. So I either interact or intervene, or I obtain identifiable private information. So identifiable, we kind of take the HIPAA identifiers. Who knows that there even are HIPAA identifiers, that there's a list of them? I see about 5, 6 hands. There are actually 18. And those are identifiers. And they are obvious ones, names, social security number, phone number. But then there's lesser ones. Health account numbers, medical record numbers, dates related to an individual. Not just your birth date, but the date you had your surgery, the date you were discharged, the date you got the drug. So all of those are considered identifiers. So if you have those, then you are obtaining identifiable private information. Private is another story. I don't know if I have a private. I don't think I do, and I'll talk about it. So that's the second question. So once we decided it's human subjects, then we decide it's research. Then we go to human subjects. Here we go. Individually identifiable means that the identity of the subject is or may be readily ascertained by the investigator or anyone on the research. So just because you're not publishing the person's name doesn't mean you have de-identified data. And I see that a lot. A lot of people say, but I'm not publishing it. Well, we in the IRB like to just give a collective duh when people say that, because there's no publication that's going to do that. We know that. We know you're not publishing the names of your participants because you would never be allowed to. We're talking about, again, human subjects protections. At what point during the course of you conducting your research, from the moment you decide you want to do it to when you start picking data from certain places here and there, saving it on your server, manipulating it through SAS, talking about it with colleagues, mailing it to someone for additional assays or analyses, could a breach happen? When could your laptop get stolen? When could someone come into your office and steal that sheet of paper off your desk? When can that happen? That's what we're looking at. So we want to know when you have that data at any point, not just the end game. And readily ascertained can mean, what demographics are you doing? So if you are doing a research study of your fellow nursing colleagues on your floor, and let's say there's 30 of them, and you want to do a survey about whether they're handling third shift well, and how their sleep patterns are, and what have you. And you've got questions like, do you think you get enough sleep? Do you think it affects your ability to perform your job? Blah, 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 blah. And then you ask questions like, how old are you? Are you an LPN, a BSN, a blah, 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 the 1,800 credentials that a nurse can have? Are you white, black, Hispanic, Asian, Pacific Islander, male, female? And then you look at it and you go, Pacific Islander? Oh, that's because there's that guy that works with you that's from Hawaii or Samoa. So you want to make sure he's captured. So within your demographics, you've nailed the male LPN from Samoa, and he's completely 100% identifiable. We did a climate survey here at UAB about 6 or 7 years ago when I first started. And it went up to 20,000 people. Within 5 questions, I was 100% identifiable. Within 5 questions, it was, Carrie Oliver said the following things. Because they had groupings of how long have you been here, and I was the newest hire, what department are you in, blah, blah, blah. And so almost immediately it was narrowed down to me out of 20, because that's how many people were in my office. And then when you started looking at when people were hired and how long they'd been here, boom, it was Carrie. And then they went on to ask incredible things about whether I liked my boss and whether, you know. So I, needless to say, did not respond, but that's readily identifiable. I'm taking a long time on some things. There's a lot of stuff on here that I'm never going to get to. I'll tell you that right now. At the IRB, at the UAB IRB, we have 4 levels of review. If you learn nothing else, there are 4 levels of review. And they're kind of in this order from riskiness. Not human subjects research, and all of these require an application to the IRB, by the way. Exempt, expedited, and full. Don't be fooled by the names. They all take about 10 working days to review. So if you're submitting to us, we ask for 10 working days. And of course, that's all contingent upon when you submit it and what it looks like when it gets to us. But 10 working days, even for full now, I should update this. It's everything, 10 working days. You should hear from us. Okay, so the big question is, what application do I fill out? And that may not be your question. You may just kind of get general knowledge. But what I want you to see from this is it's all about what you're doing. It's rarely about why. Because and that's where you're coming from, right? That's where the investigators are coming from, the why. And that's their whole raison d'etre. That's why they live. What I want to find out this information. I have a research question. I have a hypothesis. We want to know the what. So if you call and say, I'm doing a mixed methods study of a convenience population where I want to extrapolate blah, 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 and you're telling me your research question, and then follow it with, so what do I do? I have no idea, because I don't know what you're going to do to achieve your research. I don't know what data you're going to collect, who you're going to collect it from, how you're going to collect it, whether you'll have identifiers or not, what are you going to do? So on the application, it all depends. We have to ask certain questions. So we started trying to approach it from the investigator's point of view. The investigator doesn't come to us and say, oh, I really want to do an expedited research project. Or I really, really hope I can do something that goes to the full convening board. They don't do that. So I know it's shocking. So what they do is they say, I want to do a survey of people, or I want to look at these 2 drugs to see which one is more efficacious or which one's safer. So that's how they're approaching it. So that's how we approach it. So I'm just going to give some examples of how we kind of run through. So let's say I want to look at a bunch of data. I want to look at records, medical records, to see if people who prescribe this medication, who are prescribed this medication, really do better in the long term on heart failure. Or I want to look at data to see people who have had major organ transplants and whether they come back for their scheduled follow-up visits, which we all know will help them, but do they actually do it? And then maybe I want to survey them to find out why they don't. So those are the kinds of things that we would want to know. I want to do medical record review. So what I want to know then is, okay, what identifiers are you collecting? What is the source of your data? Were those data that you're going to mine collected specifically for you, or were they collected as part of clinical practice? Were they collected as part of school records? were they done for non-research purposes or for research purposes? So there's a difference in a lot of what I would tell you if you want to do a medical record review versus, I've got a colleague over here who is doing research and he wants me to analyze his samples for his research. Those specimens were collected specifically for what I'm going to do. There would be a difference in what I would have to tell you, what things I would remind you about, and whether it's retrospective or prospective. This matters because it would tell me whether you can go into an exempt category or not, whether you have to go into prospective. Identifiers being collected tells me whether or not it may be not human subjects research, whether it could go exempt, whether it could go expedited. So between those three questions, I can pretty much tell you what application to fill out. But if you notice, none of those have anything to do with your hypothesis or what you want to do. Not that we don't care, because one of the number one things we have to have is the purpose of your study. We need to understand the purpose of your study. The participant needs to understand the purpose of your study. You guys aren't very good at putting the purpose of your study in lay language. So understand that when anything human subjects related, from consent to application, you need to put it in a language that lay people understand. So let's look at some things here. This is our side-by-side category. So if no identifiers are recorded, so you don't even have access to them. This can't be done as a chart review, for example. You can't do a chart review and not have access to identifiers. There's no way, shape, or form that to be done. But if you were doing a secondary analysis on someone else's study, they already did their research, they collected it for themselves, they didn't collect that data specifically for you, and you just wanted to do a secondary analysis on that, and they agreed to turn over completely de-identified data to you, that's no identifier seen or recorded by anyone on the research staff. If, however, you want, okay, good. I just had a panic. Did I hit the right? I've been now talking for 20 minutes. Did I hit the button that I needed to hit, or did you?
did.
Thank you. If, however, you were to see all kinds of data, but you are only going to record certain amounts of data, then it could possibly go exempt. But if, however, you need all kinds of things, you really do need medical record number, you need the phone numbers because you're going to call, whatever, then it may be expedited. Exempt, everything has to be already in existence. So that was the question, retrospective or prospective. Everything has to already be in existence. So if you want to look at, let's say you had an intervention that we implemented in the hospital for improving hand washing, and you want to look at data before, and then you want the intervention to run for a little while, and then 6 months later you want to look at data after, then you're not going to qualify for exempt. You're just not. So go to expedite. There's no punishment involved there. These are just categories. These aren't saying, oh, well, you need to go to expedited then, and that's really risky, and you're going to have a lot of problems. That doesn't mean that. It just means that's what it qualifies for. So just do that. Don't get all Herculean about trying to cram it somehow into a lesser category. Do what you need to do and go there and just be done with it. Yes, it's a bigger application. So what? Do it, get it done, and do your research the way you need to do it. So that's a kind of a side-by-side comparison. So now you want to do surveys. So they come in and say, no, I don't care about data or specimens, I want to do surveys. So it depends on whether it's confidential, and there's a difference between confidential and anonymous. And I can't count how many times I've seen the sentence, your responses will remain confidential and anonymous. Those are mutually exclusive terms. So anonymous means anonymous. I don't know. I'm a researcher. I have no idea whether you even participated in my project. I don't know. I know I asked you to. I may have sent out an email to 400 people, but I have no way of knowing which of those 400 people responded and which ones, who said what. That's anonymous. But if I'm doing an interview with you, and I have to call you up and say, okay, you want to meet at Starbucks so we can have our interview? That is not anonymous. Again, we understand you will not publish people's names, but anonymous and confidential are two separate words and need to stay that way. We want to know what you're asking them. Is it sensitive or not? Those are key pieces of information. So if you say you're doing a survey and you send me an email and say I'm doing a survey, what application do I fill out? Well, I want to know. Are you getting any kind of identifiers on these people? What are you asking them? Can I see the survey? And then who are you working with? These are the three things. I can tell you whether it goes exempt, expedited, or full based on these three questions. Because if it's children, I know you can't do it in exempt. It has to be expedited or full, just depending on what you're doing. Most surveys are expedited or exempt. Only time it really goes full is at the discretion of the vice chair. There's no thing unless you're interviewing prisoners or surveying prisoners. All prisoner stuff goes full. Practically anything that has to do with prisoners goes to the full board. But other than that, most of it stays in the middle. So I have another side by side. Well, it's a little table here. So if it's a survey of sensitive topics and it's identifiable, it can't go exempt, but it can go expedited. If it's a survey of sensitive topics and it's anonymous, it can go exempt, and a lot of people don't realize that. So if I want to ask non-sensitive, so if I want to ask what's your favorite color, I can do that under exempt. And if I want to ask, or if you want to ask me what's your favorite color, exempt. If you want to ask Carrie Oliver when was the last time you smoked crack, then you now know my name. It can't go exempt. It would have to go expedited. But if you wanted to ask a whole bunch of people, when was the last time you smoked crack, and it came back anonymously, and you have no way of knowing who said what, that could go exempt. And a lot of people are nervous about that. They think, well, that can't be. But it's that anonymity. And so much is done online, we want to know, what survey site are you using? Are you getting URLs? Are you getting IP addresses? What are you getting from them? If you are getting a pen and paper survey, how is that coming back to you? So if I gave a paper survey to all of you right now, and I handed it out, and then I stood at the front, and when you were done, you came and brought it to me, and I went, okay, thank you. And you brought it to me, and I went, all right, got it. Now I know, right, she said the first thing. She didn't like my presentation very much, and oh, she liked mine, that's great. Now I know, that's not anonymous. But if I said, here's my survey, and when you're done, put them in an envelope, I've given you an envelope, put them in a box outside on your way out. So you could put a blank sheet of paper in there. You could throw it away. You can do whatever you want. I have no idea who's putting it in the box. I have no idea. So that's how we want to know all those details on the how. How are you doing it? Because we're trying to get to this information. You probably haven't thought that through yet. I just want to do a survey, David. Just shush. I just want to do that. And quit asking me all these questions. I don't know. We have to know. So we have to have you think through all of those nitty-gritty pieces. Interviews inherently can never be anonymous. So we can never have a sensitive interview under exempt. Just can't. If you're going to audio record, that is audio or video recording anything automatically makes it identifiable. As long as you're asking me what my experiences were with, driving a Prius, fine, record away. But when was the last time you committed vehicular homicide? That makes sense? Yes.
So in terms of the survey, you're talking about electronic surveys and things, do you all specify certain mechanisms that you have to use for those surveys?
So we prefer Qualtrics because we know Qualtrics, and Qualtrics has been, it is very HIPAA friendly. We also have a license here. But for example, if you're asking what's your favorite color, honestly, for sensitive studies, we prefer something that's got some heavy hitting. A SurveyMonkey can be that, but generally for you to get the kind of anonymity and security that we want, you have to purchase a certain level of it, and that's a burden to investigators. So it's probably going to become more and more important as we really, as our regulatory body catches up to, somewhere to the late 20th century, to try to figure out how to deal with online security and social media and things like that, which they haven't. Any questions? Okay. So educational research, there's a lot of that going on here, and it's not just in the School of Education, and it's not just by teachers or teaching students. This is educational research from people who want to know, did this diabetes education work out? Or I'm trying to train my nursing staff or my interns on this new procedure, and this is what I want to do. So there's a lot of educational research going on. Is it a normal educational practice? And is it being done in a common educational setting? We want to know, are you reinventing? Are you trying to come up with some really incredible novel approach? Like, if I cattle prod people, will they suddenly do better in math? Well, that's not a normal educational practice. So we're not going to just jump in there and go, sure, go ahead and do that. But even things like virtual reality and that kind of stuff that's going on right now, that's commonplace enough now, but that is kind of a common educational. It wasn't when it first started happening, but it is kind of now. You can have a commonly accepted educational setting at a mechanic shop, at a bakery, at a business. You can have it in the back of Michael's and see if people are learning to knit well. And there's lots of different places that this can happen. I'm not going to go too much into that. Most education research fits into exempt 1, I will tell you that. So then there's blood or specimen collection. And we want to know how much you're collecting and how often, because that's going to tell us whether it fits into the expedited category, because expedited categories have a very narrow allotment for how much blood you can take and how often you can take it. I'm trying to keep track of time. I don't have my phone with me, so I don't know what
35 after.
Okay. And specimen collections, we want to know whether it's invasive or not. So we want to know volume of blood and how often collected. And we want to know if you're taking other specimens, whether the collection of that specimen is invasive or not.
What if it's part of like routine care? So it's not a new procedure, it's just using what we normally get for research.
So this is blood or specimen collection. And that's a very good point. And I think I may even, nope, I don't. So if you are, as part of my research, I want to find out if there is cortisol in saliva. You don't know there is, but, and I want to know if cortisol levels go up with people who are about to jump out of a plane. This is a real research study, by the way. So they took specimens in the plane before they jumped out. And so they swabbed them out, blah, 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 or they have them spit into a cup or something like that, and they measured cortisol. Those collections were research only. There was no medical need for that whatsoever. But every year, people get flu swabs. Every year, you get that painful cram up the nose, and you get those flu swabs. And we all think they get thrown in the trash, but they do not. Medical professionals are notorious hoarders, and so they want to keep all of that stuff for some unknown reason. So we may get an application that says, people who come in for flu testing, we would like to use the swabs for this research on flu. The actual obtaining the swab is not part of the research. We want to use what's called a remnant specimen, something that I would normally throw away, but I want to keep. So it's up to the investigator to make that clear break for us to know. So if you are doing a study that is going to involve blood draws periodically from people who are from sickle cell patients, so we want to know, are you collecting them like when they come in for clinic and they're giving their specimen, are you getting an extra tube? Or are you having them come in just for you to take that blood? And that's a big distinction. It changes the risk. It changes what their experience is, what goes into the consent form. So we have to understand that. So that's a really good question. But it has to be, if this is, you're collecting it for your research, these are the things we want to know. An invasive is to say, here's a little catch that we get, what we call while you're in there studies. And people will say, these patients who are coming in for a biopsy, a lung biopsy, and we want to take 3 more biopsies while they're in there. Or people are getting their bone marrow aspirated, and we want to get some extra aspirates. The problem is that there's risk associated to that. It's not just as innocuous as piggybacking off of an existing procedure. It could prolong anesthesia. It could cause extra bleeding. It could open you up to more infection. So those don't go expedited, they go full. The full board may look at it and go, you know what though, in the long run there really isn't any added risk. They wanted 1 more puncture and they got it from surrounding tissue, so it didn't affect the ability of the pathologist to biopsy properly. Everything's good, no more, 2 more minutes on the table. They can then decide, we feel it can go expedited next year. But originally the board has to make that decision. So for other interventions, we want to know what's the risk of the participants. We want to understand our regulatory definitions and whether you're using special population. So, drugs, from drug studies to specimen studies in vitro. Here's the blood collection. So, healthy, non-pregnant, weigh at least 110 pounds, cannot, you can see, we have to know all of this information for us to decide whether it's expedited or not. So you just saying I'm going to do a blood draw is just not enough information for us. So we want to know how often, on whom. And healthy non-pregnant adults is a really interesting situation when you want to do blood draws on HIV patients. What's a healthy HIV patient? Is an HIV patient ever going to be called healthy? Can it be called healthy? So it's up to you sometimes to make that case. Well, these people who have a controlled disease state, generally they're walking around healthy, their T-cell counts are low, whatever, this is what we want to do. You make that case for them being healthy, non-pregnant adults. So what goes full, blood collection that goes full, is anything that exceeds that expedited criteria, or it could be done on a very vulnerable population, it could be done on newborns. I'm not going to go over that. Oh, there's the while you're in there studies. Drug and device studies, it's going to be on whether the drug or device is used in a way that was approved by the FDA. And a lot of our investigators have a very close and loving relationship with their drug that they're examining, and sometimes cannot see the forest for the trees. So sometimes they just think, well, but it's going to be so good, and we don't doubt that. We're saying, if you're using it in a way that was not approved by the FDA, then you need to do X, Y, and Z. It's a drag, it's inconvenient, it's necessary. It's just the rules. So they'll get frustrated. We want to know risk to participants. Is that telling me something? Okay.
No, sorry.
So that's about that's a real overview. I'm not expecting y'all to walk away with any, rich, deep knowledge, but you kind of get an understanding of where we're coming from. I want to talk a little bit about consent. And consent is a very appropriate, an important part of human subject protection. And I think on this presentation I learned how to do this, so I did this a lot. When you bring each thing up all by itself, and it's not very useful. Consent is a process. It is not the form. A lot of people, we have a consent form, we do. And we definitely need it, and we want you to use it, but it's a process. And it starts from the moment that you contact your participant, hang up a flyer in a hallway, send a letter to someone, make a phone call, anything. From that moment onward, you are starting the consent process. And it does not end until the study is completed. It doesn't mean it ends when you're done with the participant. It means it doesn't end until the study is completed. We had a study that just came through the full board a month ago. It was a pretty major study going on here at UAB. And they were very, very excited about an amendment they got to make because they were closing down the study. Because the interim results were so overwhelmingly positive that there was no need to have a randomized controlled trial. It would have been an ethical misstep to continue people on the control arm. That there was so much positive information. So they stopped the study. They said that we had to approve this letter that went out to the entire population, including press releases and all kinds of stuff that was going to be going out saying, look, everybody, we just discovered this amazing thing. That's still consent. Or, hey, we're doing a study on a drug. We randomly assigned you to this group or that group, and you didn't know what group you were in, but we have found that there are some additional risks. As we started analyzing the study, we realized that people on this drug seem to have a lot of migraines. So we need to let you know that you might be experiencing migraines as a result of being on one of the arms. That's consent. We continue that through the whole project. The conversation, when you actually sit down with a consent form, is just as important. So please don't overlook that process. That's when you really get to kind of tell them what it means. There's a lot of stuff in that consent form that just, they fly over their head. And you have to make sure that they really understand what they're getting into. It can be done in all these different ways. And I've seen every single one of them done. I've had videos, I've had flip charts, I have had stick figure pictures, assent with children. I've had things drawn out, just pictures to show things. So you know your population. We have, the funny thing for me is it took me 3 or 4 protocols to understand that when I got consent forms from the Retinal Associates, which is associated with the School of Optometry, all their consent forms were huge, they had these big, like in 24 font, and they were 18 pages. I was like, why are these so big? They can't see. Oh yeah, the participant has problems seeing, and that makes sense. And these people knew it. It took me a little while to figure it out. So they knew that. I've seen consent forms that were especially consent forms that have to do with sexual issues, that made me blush. But they were talking to their participants. They were talking to teens. They were talking to teens in certain areas of Alabama. They were using words that were interesting to hear our board discuss and have to say out loud and go into a record and be recorded. But that was their population, and they were speaking to their population. So you have to be aware of that. It has to include a lot of things. I'm not going to go over that list because you need to know it better than this list can tell you. But it comes from our regs, and it has the major things that have to be in there: voluntary, purpose. Voluntary is a really biggie. Confidential. We have a sample consent form that we want you to use. Don't reinvent the wheel. Don't do these underground swappings of things. We change things a lot, so just go here, get it, edit. We can waive consent for various reasons. Waiving consent means you're not going to get consent, period. That means the person doesn't know they're involved in a research project. But you can also waive consent documentation, which means you will get consent, but you're not going to document it with a signature. So this could be an online survey. Your email with the survey link could serve as the consent form. Or you could be doing a verbal consent over the phone. But it could also mean that they may sign the consent form, but you're not going to give them a copy of the signed consent form, which normally we would do. Normally, if they sign a consent form, we require you to give them a copy of the signed consent form. But if your project is the recidivism rate of child molesters, and Mr. Smith, who is a documented sexual offender, agrees to be on the research study, and he signs the consent form, and you get him a signed copy, and then he walks down the street and drops it, then everybody knows his business. Or everybody knows that they're HIV positive, or whatever, or that they're a former drug addict. So you have to be careful, and you may not want their name on that when they leave. So you may give them an unsigned copy of the consent form. Or you may ask us to waive documentation altogether. There may be emergency situations. Someone coming into the ER and you want to do research on them and they're unconscious. So you may waive documentation at that point, and maybe get an LAR, legal authorized representative, consent them after the fact. There's lots of different reasons for those things. So you can waive consent. No one knows that you're getting consent in any way. They're on a research project in any way, shape, or form. This is used when HIPAA doesn't apply. If HIPAA applies, you want to do a waiver of authorization and informed consent. Well, you want to waive both. They still don't know they're on a research study. These tend to be record reviews and things like that. And then waiving consent doc. I'm going to stop here to see if there's any questions, and let y'all go. Any?
Yeah. A question. So I know a lot of people now are going towards multiple institutions or part of one research study.
Mm-hmm.
Are we moving towards like a global type of protocol that can be used, like at one central IRB, and then you still have to get it approved at each individual institution's IRB as well?
You actually kind of merged a couple of issues there.
Sorry. Maybe that's because I'm a little confused about this.
Yeah, well, we are too. So when I talked at the beginning about kind of what's coming new, one of the big things is the use of central IRBs. So we are moving towards those for multi-site studies, and NIH is going to start probably mandating them for a lot of their research. And what that means is, yes, It means that the bulk of the review will be conducted by one IRB, and then that will serve for the sites. But that one IRB can't always conduct local context review. So there will almost always still be local IRB review, just not as robust and vigorous, but there will almost always be some. For instance, just until recently, we were one or two states that 18-year-olds still couldn't consent to research. So our local context would have required a review of that. We wouldn't have allowed 18-year-olds in without a special population review and that sort of thing. And there's all kinds of local laws and whatever. Anything? Yeah.
I have a question about when you're an investigator and you're the physician, because I've been in a couple of different institutions and the language is just confusing because in one institution, they really preferred that if you were the PI and you also happened to be treating the population, that you personally didn't consent to your subject because there's a conflict. Whereas other institutions, they would say you only have, you have to get special permission if you go outside your own patient population. So to me, those two things are a little incompatible.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do I understand that? Because I don't really understand that.
You also have two things going on. One's a HIPAA issue and one is a conflict issue. So for HIPAA, you can't enroll her patients without her permission allowing you to enroll her patients. And when you enroll her patients, you kind of have to do it together because her patients are going to come in and go, who are you and how'd you get my number and why are you calling me and I don't know who you are. So we want to avoid that kind of cold call feel. That is HIPAA. And so there's a lot of ways that we want that dealt with so that there's maybe a joint outreach or something like that. And then there's the conflict issue. And the conflict is there's not a one size fits all on that. It depends on what you're doing and what the risk is. So if you're using your position to convince someone to go on a very risky protocol, the board is going to be looking at that and going, well, maybe we need to kind of mitigate some of this and take some of her authority away. Why don't we have a nurse practitioner approach these patients? But most of the time, that's not the case. They're the same thing with teachers, or people who want, or managers of staff who want to do research on their staff. So we have to kind of look at it one-on-one and think, well, what are they asking to do? And is it, how horrible is it to ask you to come do an interview about chairs versus I want you to come do an interview that's going to take 4 hours. We're not going to pay you. You're going to take vacation, and we're going to ask you to write out all your phone books. First of all, I'm not sure that we would approve that, but it just depends on what you're asking them to do. We want to look at the coercive nature of it. It's not really conflict. It's more, does your authority coerce? We had a really good study in Japan, in China, where it was being done by a Chinese national, and he wanted to go in and do this research on these children. It was good research. It was about dog biting and that sort of thing. It was good research, but we had a really hard time dealing with local context because teachers are so highly revered in that country that no one, parents, students, no one would say no to a teacher. They just wouldn't. So was it really voluntary? So we had to work with local context to kind of figure out how to get around that's just a social issue there. And they were asking them to do some things and we wanted it to be voluntary. Anything else?
If you could please look around your chair and pick up your plates and cups. And there's a sign up out here.
wondering, there was a article like now 2 years ago where Facebook did a study with one of the Ivies without anybody's permission. What happened to that?
Well, Facebook didn't have any repercussions from it. It was the one that had a problem, and they kind of backpedaled, saying, "Oh no, we weren't their IRB review. We were just kind of looking at it in a consultant way." And there's been it's not finished. OHRP, I think there's still letters going back and forth between them, trying to figure out.
I read they manipulated news feeds
Everybody,
and checked,
probably
checked what was responsive for it.
But they were doing it for.
Now, are you allowed to do that? Like,
We are.
yeah. So if you have a business, you can engage in these surveys without getting legal or anything like that? Okay.
Businesses can do whatever they want, really, if it's in the, they're not contributing to generalizable knowledge. If I'm trying to figure out what's the best way to program my app to get maximum benefit, so let's see if I screw with these people, what happens?
Yeah.
That's how research. But they were teetering on it. Columbia, it was reviewed by IRB, and they did try to publish it, and they did try to make it research.
Yeah. Okay, so that's where you can do all sorts of stuff. Interesting.
Well, the only thing that was I had two questions around category. So if I am just recording the data, I get publications, which they come in for whatever, like I'm delivering something on them. And I need to check it if it's filled as well, and then I just record right down if it's filled or not. So I've got to do anything extra publication. So that falls through the expedite, right? Or is it?
I'm sure it did.
Okay. So I'm not doing any extra, but if I do something extra, like call the patient back for another checkup, that will be full. Or again, expedite.
So remember, it's about what you're going to do.
Right.
So what do you think about that makes it full?
I thought that maybe because I'm asking, I'm bringing the patient back one extra from whatever they were supposed to get because of our research.
It may help you to relook at these slides.
Okay.
Because nothing in there is remotely close to full.
Okay.
Just because you're interacting with someone, there's all kinds of interactions that fall in all of the categories.
Okay.
Interacting with somebody and intervening with somebody doesn't make it full.
Okay. Okay.
It's risk.
Okay. No, there's risk.
So
If there's a risk, it falls through the floor.
if there's risk, it definitely goes full.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sure.
But you might need to go back and look at that because you've misunderstood
Right,
something.
I just, and also for the case report, we submitted it up to 3 patients, we don't need to file an IRB. And if it's more than that, it falls through the exempt or.
It just depends on those two. It depends on what I said.
Can I ask you specific?
You can email me specific
Okay.
and I can go